All right, welcome everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I direct our Petrock program on Ukraine and also the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies. And we are delighted to be able to offer you a very interesting conversation on the Russo-Ukrainian War, religious freedom, and U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration, in conjunction with the Leib Institute for Religious Freedom and Democracy, also here at GW. The event, I think, offers a really great set of people to offer different perspectives on this important topic. And I'll actually let our moderator do the introducing of the individual speakers, but I did just want to introduce the moderator, who is Dr. Pavlo Smitsnyuk, who is a Ukrainian scholar of religion, who is a fellow here in our Petrock program for Ukraine for this academic year. It's been a real pleasure to have him here. And this is one of the passions that he brings to our institute, is this particular topic. So let me turn things over to Pavlo, who will moderate the event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Henry, for hosting us, me and us, for this conversation. And I'm also welcoming everybody who is there. There are more spaces here in front of us. So in front. If you want, yes.
Don't be shy.
Yes, don't be shy. Let's fill the chairs that we have here. Yes.
We won't bite.
Well, speak for yourself. So, welcome to everybody. Ukraine has been considered a champion of religious pluralism and religious freedom since its independence. Now, the hybrid war with Russia and later the full-scale and unprovoked aggression of Russia against Ukraine became a challenge for the country. As pieces of Ukraine, parts of Ukraine have been occupied and religious freedom has been abused in those areas, but also Ukraine tried in various ways to counteract what it perceived as instrumentalization of orthodoxy by Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the way Ukraine reacted to this weaponization of religion has surpassed the level of Ukrainian domestic policy and has risen to the level of a lot of international debates. There were UN Security Council meetings dedicated to Ukrainian Orthodoxy, but also the matter was mentioned many times in US presidential debate and by high-ranking US or by prominent US politicians. So at this panel we would like to reflect about freedom of religion through the lens of the new US administration, which has elevated religious freedom as one of its core tenet of its agenda, and claims to be willing to fight anti-Christian bias, etc. So how does the new administration view the role of religion and religious freedom in global affairs, and how its interest in religious freedom affects its approach to the Russo-Ukrainian war negotiations, etc. We have four brilliant panelists. I will be introducing each of them before they will take floor. So I will start with the very Reverend Mitred Archpriest Mark Morozovich, who is the Bishop Basil Losten Chair of Ukrainian Church Studies at the Catholic University of America. After completion of his doctorate in Rome, and it's just 600 feet from Santa Maria Maggiore, where Pope Francis was buried, a 3-minute walk from there. So after his doctoral studies, he started teaching at the Catholic University of America, where he is a professor of liturgical studies, and he has served as the Dean of Theology of the School of Theology and Religious Studies, and as an interim provost.
For all my sins.
His research focuses on various topics of liturgical history and theology in Eastern Christianity and in Ukraine. So the floor is yours. You have maximum 10 minutes, but you promised...
I promise I'll be quicker than 10 minutes. So if we look at the issue of religion, Americans tend to think that the whole world has a separation of religion and state, and that's simply not the case. So I believe that hermeneutically we have to step out of our own sort of prejudices, because we all have our prejudices of how we're looking at things, and understand people for their own. So the first image I want to put before you is the Kremlin's military cathedral, just north of Moscow, in which they have put together a whole park glorifying Stalinism, Leninism, glorifying the church as a protector of the nation, and as well having soldiers with Kalashnikovs in their hands on the mosaic paintings. If you've never seen this and it interests you more, we have a whole video on site at the Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity from the Catholic University, where we had two great scholars, including one, Sergei Chapnin, who was the head of publications for the Russian Orthodox Church, but has since left and is now at Fordham. So I think that that ideal helps us to understand that what we're looking at is really a sort of a nationalism that's utilizing religion for its own ends. And so we see this specifically in the concept of Ruski Mir. Ruski Mir was a concept that was put together in large part by the church to talk about the Russian worldview. This idea that it's wherever Russians are, people that are sympathetic to Russians. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent much time in Latin America. I have spent none, but I have lots of friends that have come from there. Olga, Romana, these Russian names. Why? Because they have used their propaganda to enable a sympathy. And so we see this certainly through the lens that we used to look at just as a political ideal about communism. And so with the fall of communism, and specifically in Russia, where there was no one held accountable for these horrendous crimes, this sort of idealism of what was past has shifted not from a political ideology, but to a national ideology, one that extols that only the Russian world is the true inheritor of Kievan Rus, and has co-opted the church in a way that it is now instrumentalized for the political gains of the empire. Putin has told us the worst calamity of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. So when we look at this engagement in Ukraine, it's a willingness to go to any lengths to subdue these people because he sees them as part of this same worldview, but doesn't realize the legitimacy of Ukrainian language or Ukrainian self-expression. It goes back for tropes that have been around for centuries. And so in this way, they're instrumentalizing religion to the point where, within Orthodoxy, you have the Patriarch of Moscow proclaiming it is blessed for you to go and kill Ukrainians. Now this has been castigated by other Orthodox, including the Patriarch of Constantinople, Istanbul we call it sometimes, who together with him and other Orthodox theologians have said that this worldview is indeed a heresy. So I think understanding that basis of the Ruski Mir is understanding how the instrumentalization of religion has come to a forefront. And one last comment is it's all through the lens of social media. And the way that our world is still trying to get our hands around this idea that we can have pictures sent immediately, videos sent immediately, and even AI-generated images of people that some people have found scandalous, but the onslaught of the information numbs people, and then they don't know what to believe. And so we're in the midst of this, and I believe that the freedom that we experience in this country enables the true freedom of humanity, which is the true freedom of religion. So how did I do, Pablo?
Very good.
5 minutes?
Very good, exactly, 5 minutes. Example to all of us, thank you. Our next speaker, unfortunately online, but she is totally with us today, is Professor Elizabeth Clark. Elizabeth Clark is Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University, where she also directs a big blog dedicated to freedom of religion, and Ukraine is very well covered. I think that several panelists have written for that. She has been the US member for the Organization of Security of Cooperation in Europe Advisory Panel for Freedom of Religion or Belief. Professor Clark has written extensively on freedom of religion or belief, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. She has analyzed legislation and draft legislation on religion from over a dozen countries for the US State Department, USAID, national governments, and international NGOs. She has spoken at the UN and OC, Organization of Security of Cooperation in Europe forums, and at over 100 academic conferences throughout the world. She has testified before the US Congress and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Together with Metrovok, she is the editor of the Religion and the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict, published in 2019. So Elizabeth, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate, and thank you, Father Mozart, for your comments. I appreciate you laying out the Ruski Mir background. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I will try to be as short as Father Mozart, but I will do my best. Today I'd like to just sort of lay out a little bit of the situation in Russia and Ukraine as regards to religious freedom, and then explain sort of how I see that these are used in the West, in the United States, sort of to further the own internal political purposes of those who advance the narratives. So first, the situation on the ground. There's certainly, I'll mention a few things about Russia and a few things about Ukraine. In Russia, as we've heard, there's very little freedom of religion. Since 2014, they clamped down on religious freedom in Crimea, on occupied territories, imposing the bans that exist in Russia, bans of Jehovah's Witnesses, ban on proselyting, discrimination against the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars. In the occupied territories, other religions besides the Russian Orthodox Church aren't permitted, and the large percentage of Protestants who used to live in that part of Ukraine have been exiled, had their property expropriated. They and other leaders have been imprisoned, tortured. It's just a very horrific situation. And that's part of the response of the West in terms of sanctions. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been the outlier in Eastern Europe. It's been exceptional for the levels of religious freedom that have been there over the years. At this point, as you all know, there's the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The main religious freedom challenge in Ukraine right now, there's two. One is Bill 8371, which was passed last fall. I'm sure you've heard of it. This is a law that sets it up so that the government can ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, one of the two Orthodox churches that had ecclesiastical ties with Russia. They claim that they've declared independence. There's a lot of debate about what does that mean. Independence is not really a term, as I understand it, that has significant meaning in the Orthodox context. It's not autocephaly, but at any rate, it's there. So the government has ordered to cut ties with Russian Orthodox Church or be banned. This is problematic. Laws restricting the right to religious organizations, there's a right internationally to be able to have a legal entity status, and that can only be limited for situations that are pressing and necessary in a democratic society. Here, the law essentially is set up so that it not only punishes individuals for harm, for sedition, or for passing on propaganda, but here the provisions allow banning of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for just having ecclesiastical ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. And this has been justified publicly for a number of reasons. I'll get into that in just a minute. The other main problem with religious freedom in Ukraine right now is the lack of a conscientious objection law, which has led to a number of Jehovah's Witnesses and some evangelicals being jailed for conscientiously objecting to serving in the military. So how does this come up in the West? We want to talk about this in the Trump administration. As I see it, these events, particularly in Ukraine, get spun into two very different narratives, neither of which is really entirely accurate. One is this idea of persecution narrative. You hear this from some of the Republicans, Senator Marjorie Greene, J.D. Vance before he became a vice president, claiming that Ukrainian governments banned an entire Christian denomination, or that this is an assault against Christianity, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church lobbies in the United States has said, oh, this is religious cleansing. The other narrative is one that says, no, there's no violations in Ukraine. Ukrainian Orthodox Church is an arm of the Russian Orthodox Church. It's weaponized. Therefore, of course, the government can restrict it or ban it as needed. So the regions, including this idea of a weaponized church, there's also the idea that Russia is the one who violates religious freedom, not Ukraine. We don't want to focus on Ukraine because comparatively there's so much worse things going on, and certainly are. Others will cite to the fact that the law has overwhelming support from the population in Ukraine, or some people argue, well, the law will still allow people to worship, even if it takes away the legal entity status, so that it's good enough. Well, and there's problems with both narratives, as I mentioned. Let me mention a few. I'm trying to keep this short, so if there's more questions, I'm happy to go into this in more detail in Q&A. The persecution narrative is incorrect. Ukraine still is one of the most religiously pluralist countries in Eastern Europe. It has greater protections of religious freedom than most, certainly more than Russia. The law does violate human rights. It does violate freedom of religion or belief, international norms, in sanctioning an entire community for its ecclesiastical decisions. But it's not, we're not talking the level of persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China or Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. This gets blown out of proportion by many people. We see this on the evangelical side of people who, for the last 10 years or so, have tried to cozy up to Putin in many ways. They find alignment on issues of the conservative beliefs on gender and family. So a desire to support that front leads some to emphasize the violations of religious freedom to the point of calling them persecution and looking at those to the exclusion of all else. On the other hand, you also have some religious freedom advocates, Ukrainian representatives of parliament and Zelensky himself, who have claimed that there are no violations, that it's permissible to restrict a weaponized church. This narrative is also problematic because if you look carefully at the case law and the international norms on these areas, banning a religious organization, stripping an organization of its religious entity status is a significant step, and it's very problematic. This is not something that would be considered acceptable in any Western country, and it's not clear why some people are willing to give Ukraine a complete pass on this. I understand that people don't want to be useful idiots, that they don't want to advance Russia in what's clearly unjust aggression. But I think it's not doing Ukraine a favor to overlook the fact that there are some serious human rights concerns with this, especially when Ukraine wants to be part of the EU or NATO, or part of the sort of family of countries that follow the rule of law and human rights. So briefly, we'll talk more about this, and I know my colleagues will, about the policy in the Trump administration. I'll just say that it would be interesting to see where they go. During the first administration, there was a lot of talk about religious freedom with the Trump administration. Aside from the work of the Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department with Senator Brownback and Knox and others that was really stellar, there was very little on religious freedom that was actually done. And so I'm not sure that we'll see much from the Trump administration. And in conclusion, I just want to say that I think it's important from the Trump administration to continue to articulate the value of religious freedom for everyone at home and abroad, and to be able to be principled and consistent. And I will address more issues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And our next speaker is Peter Mandaville. Peter Mandaville is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and he's also a senior research fellow at the Georgetown University's Beckley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, a center which also dedicated a lot of space to Ukraine and freedom of religion. During the Biden administration, he served as director of the USAID's Office of Faith-Based Partnerships and as a senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at the United States Institute of Peace. Both, yes, have been victims of the purge that has occurred very recently. His prior government experience includes serving as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff and a senior advisor in its Office of Religion and Global Affairs. His most recent book is The Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, How States Use Religion in Foreign Policy, with a chapter, I think, on Russia and Ukraine. And it has been published by the Oxford University Press. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Pablo. So, what I'd like to do is to draw together strands of insight that were offered by both Mark and Elizabeth to start bringing our conversation into the domain of contemporary U.S. foreign policy. And I know that Knox is someone who's been heavily involved in U.S. international religious freedom policy, will be able to kind of, explore the details of that vector even more fully during his remarks. So, Elizabeth spoke just now about this crisis within the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, where you have two entities, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, both claiming to be the legitimate expression of Orthodox Christianity in Ukraine. And I want to take that Ukrainian context and telescope out to the broader global context of the Orthodox communion, because Ukraine's religious tensions are reflective and in many ways generative of broader tensions within the global Orthodox communion, and ones in which it's impossible not to see the clear presence of geopolitics. So when His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in 2019 issued the tomos that recognized the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the period running up to that act exacerbated long-standing tensions between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, leading to Moscow actually breaking ties with the Ecumenical Patriarch. Now, this is a tectonic event in the Orthodox world, right? This is an earthquake that to this day continues to reverberate in contemporary Orthodoxy. Because for those of you who are not so familiar with the structure of authority within the global Orthodox communion, and it's not, the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate is not analogous to the superordinate position that the Bishop of Rome holds within the Roman Catholic tradition, as the very top of the pyramid, as it were. Rather, in the global Orthodox communion, you have, depending on exactly how you count them, 16 or 17 local Orthodox churches, mainly organized nationally, even though they're called local Orthodox churches, whose primates are all equal to each other, but with the Ecumenical Patriarchate serving as a sort of first among equals with particular responsibility for ensuring fellowship and communion within this family. And when the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was granted that status in 2019, what you saw is the other Orthodox churches responding in various ways. A number of other churches followed the Ecumenical Patriarch and recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. They tended to be the churches that are considered the sort of Greek or Western wing of the Orthodox Church. Another handful of churches followed with Moscow and refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Openly, explicitly rejected it, in fact. They tended to be from the more Slavic wing of the Orthodox Church. Another handful kind of tried to walk a fine line in the middle, neither accepting nor explicitly rejecting the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But it's impossible not to see the reverberation of geopolitics and broader geostrategic divisions within the Orthodox Church emerging around this particular moment. And this is where we connect very quickly to the analysis of the Ruski Mir concept that Mark offered, right? Because he made, I think, a very important point that while some who think of the Russian world concept think of it as mainly focused on peoples who are themselves ethno-linguistically Russian, meaning that it's a narrative that's focused primarily on Russia's own near abroad, and perhaps the Slavic world beyond that, Slavic cultures, Slavic languages, Orthodox Christian societies and cultures. That's absolutely true. But he made a very important point that the Ruski Mir concept is something that people who are broadly sympathetic to Russia, who are not necessarily Russian themselves, can participate in, right? And this is where we see the geopolitical power and salience of the Ruski Mir concept. Because one of the things that Putin has tried to do in terms of the value proposition that Russia is offering to the world is this idea that Russia will serve as the world's champion of traditional and family values, right? And so part of Russian soft power engagement over the last couple of decades has been about reaching out to societies in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, as Mark mentioned, societies that tend to be more socially conservative, with a discourse that essentially says, hey, the West, Western Europe, the United States, these are countries that are forcibly exporting feminism, LGBTQ rights, transgender ideology, and forcing them down your throats. We in Russia, we will serve as the guardian of traditional and family values, the values that are present in your societies, and so you need to be more aligned with us, right? And the reason that this begins to connect to US foreign policy is because some of the entities connected to this marriage of convenience between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin, and I'm speaking of various organizations, transnational activist networks and foundations connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, also work in close partnership with conservative American evangelical groups as well, meaning that there is a certain level of connectivity and alignment between conservative evangelical, a certain segment of American conservative evangelical Christianity, and these broader Russian and Russian Orthodox Church infused global discourses. And unsurprisingly, of course, some segments of that American conservative Christian political base is a very important component of the political support for President Trump and the current administration, which then brings us to this question of, well, how should we think about religion and religious freedom in the context of the current US administration? And here, those of us who've been following this space have been, I think, a little bit puzzled, because the expectation was that, as has been the case with many changes in administration in the United States, where Democratic administrations tend to care less about religious freedom and Republican administrations tend to emphasize it more. Elizabeth already mentioned the huge, at least rhetorical emphasis on religious freedom articulated by the first Trump administration. Knox was involved in some of the operational dimensions of that. The expectation was that the second Trump administration would also, place a premium on religious freedom promotion around the world, and that more broadly, there would be great openness to partnership and engagement with religious actors across aspects of US diplomacy and development. What we've seen is again, a puzzling record, I think, because of the intense, frantic pace of changes that this administration has made in its first 100 days. I mean, I think all of us in Washington have been kind of caught off guard and somewhat dazzled by the dismantling of USAID, fundamental reforms at the State Department, the dismantlement of one of my other former homes, the U.S. Institute of Peace. And what those changes have meant, I mean, not intentionally, accidentally, but in practice what they've meant is that the offices that had been created over the last 20 years at the likes of USAID, USIP, the State Department, for engaging religion and religious actors have themselves been dismantled, meaning that at present, there is nowhere within the US foreign policy and national security apparatus any dedicated institutional capacity for thinking about and engaging religion. Even within the religious freedom domain, which everyone thought would be safe under this new administration, the broader changes affecting the human rights architecture at the State Department seems also to be having the effect of starting to dilute the coherence and extent of the capacity even to promote religious freedom abroad at the State Department. At the same time, of course, we've seen the Trump administration reestablish a White House faith office. We've seen the creation of a new task force focused on anti-Christian bias, primarily in the domestic realm, and also talk about a new religious freedom commission whose exact composition and role remains unclear. And so, I think what we have is a situation in which, as Elizabeth has said, we kind of need to wait and see. It's not entirely clear where this administration is going to go on these issues. There's mixed messages going on. But Elizabeth did very appropriately point out to the way that the debate about religious freedom became something of a political football in the last year and got attached to debates and discussions about whether the United States should continue to provide military support to Ukraine, with Ukraine's detractors emphasizing the idea that the Ukrainian government is persecuting Christianity. I think Elizabeth has done a very effective job at explaining why the sort of black and white of those two competing discourses are actually full of many shades of gray. I suspect that given the nature of the relationship between President Trump and his political base within the conservative evangelical communities, they will likely follow his lead on this issue with respect to the sort of security and geopolitical dimensions of the issue. What we have yet to see and tell is whether the administration is going to actually specifically engage, say, or do anything about the religion and religious freedom side of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your deep and insightful analysis. Now the floor would go to Professor Knox Thames. Knox Thames is an international human rights lawyer, advocate, and author who has dedicated his career to promoting human rights, defending religious minorities, and combating persecution. He served for over 20 years in the US government. He held several key positions advocating for freedom of religion and belief, including at the State Department and 2 different US government foreign policy commissions. Knox has deep experience regarding all sorts of regions, Central Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and US foreign policy relating to human rights. And he served both under Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations and worked at the intersection of global affairs, religion, and human rights. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll start my presentation by just talking about, or frame my presentation by a conversation I was a part of back in March when I met a group of Ukrainian Protestant pastors to hear their concerns about what was happening in Ukraine and occupied territories due to Russian aggression. And it happened to be just a couple of hours before the fireworks that exploded in the Oval Office between President Trump and President Zelensky. The pastor's visit had been long planned, so it was mere coincidence that they happened to be in Washington on the same day. But their goal was simple and twofold. First, to thank the United States for the support in giving Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves, and to encourage continued support. They talked about, they had the first-hand perspective of the indiscriminate shelling, the religious persecution, and the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. And for me, it was helpful to hear them talk about the existential threat that they were facing because of Russia's aggression and the need for continued American support. And their goal was to try to connect with Americans of faith, other Protestants who cared about issues of religious freedom. We all know that when Putin launched the invasion, he tried to invoke religion as part of the justification, thinking that the shared Orthodox history might lend credibility to his imperial ambitions, but Ukrainians beg to differ. And I think in many ways, it's really interesting to compare Ukraine against Russia today. Of course, looking at Ukraine itself, no country is perfect. There are issues of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as there are in many parts of the world. Elizabeth mentioned her concerns, which I also share, about Religion Law 8371, which passed last fall, that could create a process for banning the Russian Orthodox Church and related organizations. But I think we have to recognize the novel challenges the Ukrainian government is facing at this moment, challenges that traditional religious freedom advocates like myself we haven't encountered in Europe. The law did lay out a review process which was grounded in law, and in the Q&A I'd welcome Elizabeth's perspective on how often has it been invoked. I haven't heard of widespread banning of Russian Orthodox churches, as some feared. In this new issue of conscientious objection, the Supreme Court recently ruled about Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's going to be something Ukrainians need to sort through to make sure that all Ukrainians have their conscience rights respected in the context of this existential battle. But what has always made Ukraine distinct was how it balanced or managed or just created space for different expressions of Orthodoxy, different expressions of Christianity. It certainly made it unique among former Soviet republics in Eastern and Central Europe. Same time, we see Protestant denominations, the Catholic Church, Judaism, Islam, all practiced freely. You know, comparing that against Russia, Russia is light years behind Ukraine and how it treats religious freedom domestically, and especially in the occupied territories. Russia's abysmal domestic record demonstrates really what's at stake should Putin prevail, God forbid. In fact, in a rare area of agreement between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, both have labeled Russia as a persecutor of religious freedom every year since 2020. And the Biden administration went so far as to designate Russia as a country of particular concern, which is the worst label a country can be given for religious freedom violations, as well as name the Wagner Group as an entity of particular concern. Others have reported on the abuses that we've seen at the hands of Russia. The International Institute for Religious Freedom has reported, quote, over 630 places of worship, including churches, mosques, synagogues, and houses of prayer, have been destroyed or damaged by Russian shelling. UNESCO has also verified damage to almost 150 religious sites due to Russian attacks. So going back to that conversation with the Ukrainian delegation, they had three key messages for America's faithful. First, they wanted to dispel Russian misinformation that Ukrainians are somehow persecuted. No, they said Ukrainians enjoy full religious freedom. And second, they sought to correct the misplaced concerns about the Ukrainian government persecuting others by showing that the real persecution is happening in the occupied territories. And finally, most desperately, they begged for help to help recover the 20,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russia. One evangelical pastor put it bluntly. He said, quote, "This war is not about land, which Russia has plenty of. This war is about erasing Ukrainian identity from existence." So again, this idea that this is an existential struggle. We know, as has been mentioned, Putin sees this through an ideological, even spiritual framework with this concept of Ruski Mir. His desire to revive the old Russian Empire with state and a co-opted Russian Orthodox Church working in tandem. The pastor shared about how in occupied Ukraine, religious leaders who refused to bend the knee face a grim fate. Many pastors have been, quote, taken to the basement, a chilling euphemism for torture and likely deaths, and they knew of at least 36 pastors who have been disappeared. Now, Ukraine wasn't asking for American soldiers, wasn't asking for America to fight its war, just for simple continued support, so they can continue to wage their war, their struggle for survival. This new partnership that was announced regarding natural resources, I think, hopefully will create a stronger partnership between Ukraine and the United States, as well as with our European allies. And if negotiations with Russia don't include the return of occupied territories, I think this is interesting that pastors implore the United States to insist on religious freedom, at least in the occupied territories, and the return of the children. And so there are some moments coming up, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, where we'll start to see how the Trump administration views Russia in light of Ukraine. Firstly, by whether or not it will continue the designation of Russia as a country of particular concern. That should be happening in the next couple of months. But in summary, the message for the Ukrainian delegation was clear, and I think can be shared by many here. This war is not just a war of weapons, it's one of survival, it's one of identities, a war for the soul of the nation. And so how will the U.S. engage on these issues of international religious freedom in the context of war and these other issues that we know have been so gripping? I think we have to wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Knox, for sharing your vision of what is going on. I think we now have, thanks to the punctuality, yes, of our panelists, a lot of time for discussion. So I'm inviting you to yes, raise your hands and ask questions. Why?
I just had a clarifying question for Mr. Mandeville about
Maybe introduce yourself,
oh,
yes,
okay.
and speak.
Sure.
Speak
My name is Clara Bennett. I work on religious freedom in Syria, so just the general topic. So it's very interesting to hear it from this perspective. I am just wondering, because you mentioned about the USERF what you serve, like the existing U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, how you see that playing a role going forward. You mentioned something about there may be a new you serve, or it'll be, or what did you mean by that?
Right. So I wasn't talking about the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is an independent public agency. It's not part of the executive branch by design, because when it was created as part of the International Religious Freedom Act, the idea was to create kind of if the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom was going to be the primary U.S. governmental watchdog for international religious freedom globally, the Commission was necessary to be the watchdog of the watchdog. Is that fair to say, Knox?
Yes.
I feel very self-conscious talking about this in front of someone who was the director of policy producer for many years. But the idea was that the U.S. State Department might be tempted for diplomatic reasons to be soft on certain countries that were useful to the U.S. for strategic and security reasons when it came to their human rights records, who needed a totally independent space that would be able to call them out. So that an entity still exists. It just was recently reauthorized for a short period of time. I think there's still questions around its longer-term fate. What I was referring to mainly is some potential changes occurring literally at present, or like right now, to the Office of International Religious Freedom within the State Department, right? The one that issues the main annual reports about human rights around the world. During the National Prayer Breakfast address, President Trump, among the announcements about the White House Faith Office and this task force on anti-Christian bias, also referred to the creation of a new commission, Religious Freedom Commission. And I think a lot of people got confused because they connected in their mind to the existing Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I think there's not a lot of activity. Knox may know more. There's a lot of details about it, but I think the idea is that would be a commission primarily focused on domestic U.S. religious freedom issues. But Knox, do you know more about that?
I don't know more, but I think I have the same read on it, that this is a domestic issue, because it's the domestic religious liberty issues that really energize the base, that bring people to the polls, and the international issues don't.
Right.
So my assumption is this is all in the context of the domestic religious liberty battles.
Thank you.
Okay. So you were first?
I don't know.
You can go first.
Okay,
So go and then
hello. First of all, thank you very much for bringing this together today. I'm Dr. Elaine Soreo, and I'm the Associate Director of Ukrainian American Concordia University, which is a Ukrainian university based in Kiev, Ukraine, and has been operating throughout the war online. I would like to draw attention to something that everybody has touched on at different points and at different depths, and that is Russia's propaganda and disinformation. As it's been used, not just become so much to the point where everybody at some time discusses it on this panel, other panels, but it has been going on not just with this war, not just with the start of it, with the invasion of Crimea, but this goes back. How would you like to address how the West, Europe, US, how are they to address the ongoing propaganda versus actually what I have encountered, a denial in many quarters, particularly in the United States, of the active Russian propaganda? It's open for it. Go for it, guys.
Well, I'll just...
Guys and
No,
Elizabeth,
no, no,
yes.
yeah.
Also,
guys-
feel free, Elizabeth, yes,
guys-
to jump in when you want.
Guys doesn't mean without. Come on now.
So I think a lot about these issues. I think that as a society, we're still in the midst of understanding the impact of social media. You know, I have friends in Ukraine that send me photos, and if I don't hit the like button on it, I hear about it. You know, we're conditioned. We're conditioned in a way that we get this immediate experience. And the conditioning is not just that, it's that we get to see exactly what we like, and and as we feed the cookies in there, and it learns about us, and this will only increase with AI, that we'll get more and more things that agree with us, and so the ability to engage in thinking, critical thinking, is at a huge problem.
Yeah.
I think I'm no psychologist, but I think that we can as well look to the rise of depression, and what it's linked with screen time. And so all of these things all play in together by limiting our ability to engage with the other, and limiting the ability to have a real decent exchange and conversation. You know, the idea of a debate is almost completely eroding from our society. You know, so that I believe that we need to train people to think, and think critically, and to be critical consumers of what they're taking in. So I think all of those things are at play. You have people being worn down in this country, people that are certainly worn down in Ukraine, in Russia specifically. You know, and you see some of the rare people that make it out and that are critical. You know, Navalny was killed for this, killed for asking questions. And to me, I think that certainly it's religious freedom, but it's the freedom of expression, the freedom of dialogue, the freedom of combating, that's all at stake. And this is a problem not just with Russia disinformation. This is a problem at stake in all disinformation. When we're told that, no, that's not what I said, and we know plain well, we have the video proof of it. But no, you're being told that, no, you don't know, I'm telling you again. And so it's a challenge that we face, and it's something that the Kremlin has mastered, and it's something that it's using to put its agenda forward to control people. And so I see it as a huge problem.
I would
Yeah, I
offer.
can jump in.
Oh, yeah, please,
Oh, go
Elizabeth.
ahead.
No, please go ahead. Please, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just going to briefly say that this is a significant problem. I agree with Mark. And when you have a closed society like Russia, where the media is controlled by the government, where there's not a lot of engagement with the outside, how can you change the narrative? How can you fight back against the propaganda that's being put out all the time, that Ukraine is somehow taken over by Nazis? I mean, this has been going on for such a long time. I think that some of the answer is the kind of soft power mechanisms that sadly seem to have all been shut down in the last few months. I mean, I think of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, did enormous good during the Soviet era, just by exactly that, right? Trying to counter the narrative, trying to give facts, trying to reach people that otherwise couldn't be reached. So, I don't know, maybe my other panelists have some more ideas.
So this is an issue that I unexpectedly dealt with very regularly when I was appointed as the director of USAID's Faith-Based Partnership Office, which is the fact that on an almost daily basis, programs that we were trying to support and run in, for example, parts of East Africa, program directors on the ground would contact USAID headquarters and say, look, there are local religious groups that are telling their communities that if they participate in this USAID reproductive health program, they will be forced to sign papers recognizing multiple genders or committing to support same-sex marriage, which isn't true. This was mis and disinformation, and when you did a little bit of due diligence and forensics on it, the connections to Russia became clear very, very quickly. And it wasn't just social media. It was also well-funded transnational advocacy groups operating on the ground that were doing this. So part of the problem is social media. Part of it is this enormous, vast global network of this movement that's been created. The question then is, how do you engage with it? You know, one approach that I'm aware of as being present is, you know, people that are kind of from more progressive branches of Christianity saying, oh, the traditional family values side of the aisle has spent decades and billions to build up this network, and we've been sleeping while it's been created. So we now need to create our own version of it. You know, but again, that's the persistence of the polarization, the us and the them. You know, I am someone who in the work that I was trying to do, wanted to try to create spaces and capacities for having difficult conversations about these issues, including with faith communities, right? So that you don't simply counter faith-based objections to LGBTQ rights with an insistence based on, contemporary human rights that no, gay rights are absolute and absolute. That you need to find spaces where you can have conversations that will enable people to deal with the real everyday life manifestations of these problems. It's difficult, but part of what the US government's religious engagement capacity function was about was trying to figure out how to enable those kinds of conversations. So the fact that that's been destroyed by this administration, I worry decreases our capacity to engage on these issues.
I would just add, reality is the battlefield as well in Ukraine, and how it's perceived, how it's constructed, how it's painted, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's being aware of really needing to drill down to understand what are you receiving as accurate, factual, or not is incumbent upon everyone, and just grabbing stuff off the internet is no longer sufficient to know what's happening.
Okay. So we have Ethan at the middle, and then gentleman there, and then okay.
Thank you all for the panel. I'm Ethan Kerr. I'm a student here at GW. My question is open to everyone, but specifically directed to what Professor Clark was talking about earlier in regards to the laws in Ukraine with religious freedom. Playing somewhat of devil's advocate here for the Ukrainian government, their position would be that there have been clergy members who have gone to Moscow to support these events when they've taken over parts of Ukraine. There has been direct clergies who have taken over, especially in Crimea and in the Donbass and Luhansk region. So my question is, when does government, while I think everyone here supports religious freedom, but when does government say that these are not state actors, these are not religious actors, they are now state actors, and when can that be against religious freedom, or is this still a protection of the state's interest?
No, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think it gets at the heart of some of the debates that people are having right now about this law, and I think there was productive and appropriate debates on this law. The limits include this idea that the limitations have to be necessary in a democratic society. That's one. You see in the European Court of Human Rights over and over again. Necessary and sufficient. There's rule of law constraints as well. And so between the rule of law constraints and the necessary constraints, you can't ban churches or put restrictions on freedom of religion or belief if the restrictions are overbroad or ineffective or regulate thoughts and beliefs or potential harms but not illegal actions. Any discrimination purely on the basis of something internally religious violates the principle of autonomy, that religious organizations should be able to choose their own beliefs. And ecclesiastical ties are part of those internal beliefs, right? So if that's the only reason that you're punishing them, that's a problem. It's a problem with the rule of law if you punish a group for the actions of some of its members, right? Traditionally, it's been understood to be necessary to ban a whole group if it's so interwoven with the membership, with the leadership, that there is no other way to address this problem. And I think that's the problem here, is because there are other ways that Ukraine is addressing the problem, right? There's other offenses that exist for public denial of Russian aggression, propaganda for the war, justification, legitimization, non-public denial of the military aggression, spreading ethnic and religious hate. Those are all existing laws that cover most of what bothers people about what's happening in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I think it's also important to look at it in terms of perspective. there's been, as I understand, about, at this point, about 70 convictions of priests, which of course is not a small number. That there are any is problematic. But when you look at it, you say that there are 10,000 clerics in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and there have been 73 convictions. I think that case for this being necessary really fails. I think some of it's just a knee-jerk reaction. I had this long conversation with a representative of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church after a panel we both spoke on, and I completely understood where he was coming from. They want to ban anything associated with Russia, especially one where it's been seen as a mouthpiece for justifying the war. But I think there is a problem. There's a reason that there are human rights. There's a reason that there's a right to freedom of religion. And here, religion in the international norm framework, the idea of freedom of religion during wartime is not something that people didn't think of, right? These international norms were drafted right after World War II, right after finishing a horrific war, and the international norm specifically bars governments from derogating in times of emergency, right? That's legalese to say governments can't say this is wartime, so we're going to put religious freedom on the shelf. That was the understanding from the drafters who had lived through the war, who'd seen what happened when that was the case in Germany. This is not just sort of a dreamy idealism, but I think it's important to continue to protect freedom of religion, even for people we deeply disagree with and whose positions we find immoral.
Can I jump in on that? Yes. Just when I think of this, and I was trying to understand what the purpose was, I first looked at, well, is this law going to try to penalize what someone believes, right? And so under international human rights standards for freedom of religion or belief, there's this concept of forum internum and forum externum. And so it's absolutely clear that no government has the right to dictate or punish people for what they believe. This law didn't do that. It gets into the forum externum. So how are communities of beliefs organizing themselves in a time of emergency in this unique moment? And I personally didn't think this law was wise for the Ukrainians to enact because they have the tools to address the concerns that were stated. But I don't think it failed the test that Elizabeth enunciated, that the European Court of Human Rights has outlined about being necessary and sufficient in a democratic society. I think it actually met that test. And there are ways to appeal the process. It's not some bureaucrat, we've seen in other post-Soviet environments, can just say, you're banned, you're out of business, and you're going to jail if you gather. There's appeal processes, it goes into the court system. So should they have done it, I think is a question I have, but did it meet the sort of European legal standards for having a law like this? I think you can make a pretty good argument that it did.
Could I just...
Can I respond a bit? I don't want to
Please, yeah.
steal away the conversation if we've got more questions from the audience, though.
The only thing, I agree with you with what you've just presented, because I think what's happening is we're back to propaganda. And the issue of propaganda, this became a very potential tool for Russia to point and use the propaganda aspect against Ukraine for what actually didn't really take place. Yes, there's a law, but a lot of it had to do with some pretty iffy things that were going on, and so what did they have at hand? They created.
And this is where I get to was it wise?
Yeah,
in
exactly.
This environment,
yeah.
When it can be, because it is questionable. I am worried about it. I think it could be abused.
But maybe also you look at it in the sense that they were creating a law that is up for people to be able to discuss whether that, just as you have. In other words, It's there, and then everybody discusses, well, is this really working for us? And maybe it's something that'll be changed relatively soon, considering the evolution. You know, we're back to this information. Everybody's supposed to respond. People want your response like that, right? That's not the way human beings work. And you know, the war is longer. This thing is going to go on for a while.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, do you want to?
Oh, if I may, I'm not sure I heard everything at the end there, but let me respond to what I heard, and if I didn't respond to something, please feel free to bring it up again. And in this, I think I can also sort of respond to Knox's question earlier. Right, has the law been enforced yet? Is it just a theoretical harm? And I think, yes, it has not been enforced to be able to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church yet, and that's a good thing. I'm hopeful that it won't be, and that this can, even though I think the law violates freedom of religion and belief, that we can steer away from that to more productive channels that aren't going to be self-destructive for Ukraine. But I think that it has had an immediate consequence, even if it hasn't immediately banned the Russian Orthodox Church, right? The law allows the government to, both the local level and the federal level, to pull contracts with the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They don't need any explanation, they don't need a reason, they can just say, we're not going to keep leasing you this land anymore. That's a problem. The law has been used by many to legitimize some of the local violence against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or forcible movement of parishes. There's been a lot of voluntary movement of parishes too, I'm not trying to deny that. But there has been reports of some violent ones, and having this sort of official government statement that we think it's okay to ban this church, we think that they are the enemy, then it's not too surprising when you see people on the ground treating them like the enemy. So I think that it does have an immediate impact. Hopefully it won't have the most drastic impact. I think the reason it hasn't been enforced yet, because the Department for the State Service for Ethnic Affairs and Freedom of Conscience, the sort of one where Victor Yelensky's over, has they've drafted regulations to be able to implement it. The cabinet just hasn't adopted them yet. Part of the reason this whole thing has been delayed, the law allowed for a year before they were going to start banning, is because I think there's people who are savvy enough to realize, yes, this would be a public relations disaster internationally, because the law just isn't correct. But the hope by those in government is if we put enough pressure, then there'll be more parishes, more leadership that will voluntarily defect to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And that bothers me. I think that's not the role of a government office, to be pressuring people to leave one church to go to another. And the law does allow banning for some very sketchy reasons that include beliefs, to respond to Knox's other point. If the church has been blessed by the Russian Orthodox Church, it can be banned. If the Russian Orthodox Church has in its statutes that it governs the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church can be banned, right? So you've got things that are completely even out of their control that allow it to be banned, and then there's some that are very vague. I mean, some of the prosecutions of Russo-Ukrainian Mir, I mean, I think Russo-Ukrainian Mir is a travesty and ought to be fought back against, but as a legal matter, some of the restrictions are very, very broad. So
Thank you.
I think it's still of concern.
Thank you very much. Let me combine two questions. Danilo and then the gentleman in below suit.
Thank you very much.
Introduce yourself.
Yes. So my name is Danilo Kolas. I'm a fellow of the St. Gabriel Institute of Communications and Diplomacy. It's a small institute of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. I'm based here in DC for communications and diplomacy. First of all, thank you all for your speeches. I'm going to continue this train of thought a little bit. My question is quite similar, but maybe in a more quote-unquote positive direction. So now, being of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, we've felt on our own skin over the past centuries the instrumentalization of the Russian Orthodox Church on Ukrainian territory, and its very direct involvement in the persecution of other Christians, and obviously right now in the ideological platform for the invasion. And so obviously, not only on a governmental level, but as you said before, on a grassroots population level, there has been a lot of flashback against even just the existence of this church, and so there was a lot of pressure also coming from just general populace. In your view, obviously, we've even heard from Ukrainian lawyers that we've had the advantage or the honor of speaking to, that this is not a great law, the way it has been placed. In your view, what can or what could the Ukrainian government do? Because this is a problem that they need to deal with. How can one go about in fighting this instrumentalization of this church that is happening, and where it seems that it's a very perfect platform because you have this immunity, quote unquote, in the form of religious freedom, and that's a great channel for propaganda in other places. So if you could maybe, any one of you expound on what are possible channels of combat.
Thank you, Danilo.
Okay, J.P. Hogan, I've written publicly on Twitter on a lot of this over the years. But there's at least three things that are concerning. The use of saying Ukraine is for democracy when it's with NATO. That there's this idea that socialism has failed where it's crossed a line too irreligious. And in Russian culture, literary culture, they have no history of respecting borders over poetry and a sense of revolution. So in some ways, Putin may be working a problem, and he sees the propaganda of Ukraine wanting to go to NATO as more troublesome propaganda. Whereas democracy for America and our religious liberty is people get to self-govern and religion first. That's not what one side of our partisan divide now wants. So if the first democracy is supposed to be we're protecting people who can have Bible-based communities and practice locally, as what the American democracy is supposed to be, and climate change has been the authoritarian march where you believe what we say are the solutions. Are they working a problem where they are seeing their people were becoming too irreligious, and that has been somehow socialism has been failing where it crosses the line? Which brings up with Ukraine, if there's too many religions, a nation that loses its religion stops being a nation. It's an old adage. If you're allowing too many, you're maybe that irreligious in a different way. So there's a lot, there's more, but there are at least three primary things: the concern about irreligious, the concern about democracy being propaganda, and that Ukraine wasn't necessarily for propaganda. But the other one I used, when a socialist fights a socialist against socialism, I mean, who's supposed to win? The more Marxist? So it's the cultural history there. It's in some ways it's stuck with Russians fighting Russians, and no one knows how to win. Well, I could just take a stab at the Russians fighting Russians. These are not Russians, these are Ukrainians that are being killed. My grandparents came to this country 100 years ago. My parents were born here, I was born here, I'm a priest of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. Як я би хотів говорити по-українському в Русі, вони мені не би хотіли знати. So I spoke what I said in Ukrainian was, if I went to Ukraine, to Russia, and I spoke in Ukrainian, boom. They wouldn't want to hear me, they wouldn't, any place, number one. Number two, the Ukrainian Catholic Church is outlawed in Russia today. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is a result of the 1596 Union of Brest that historically encompassed lands to Lithuania, Belarus, and mostly eastern Ukraine. I won't get on the whole story because it's too long and complex. That has been systematically taken over by Russia and told that you cannot exist. You cannot be, you cannot do this way, and finally it existed. This church was arrested in 1945, and the illegal synod in 1946 declared that it could not exist. The church went into the underground. It was the largest persecuted church in the world. This is the Ukrainian Catholic Church that came out of the underground in '88 and '89 with stories of thousands of priests, lay people, nuns who were incarcerated because they were Ukrainian, because they wanted to worship as they please. So that's the plain facts of what's happening today. There are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Catholics in Russia that have no ability to organize as Ukrainian Catholics. They organize within Latin Catholic parishes to be able to exist. So, in this country, we have a parish here on Harewood Road. You're all welcome. We have a Ukrainian Orthodox parish on New Hampshire Avenue. They say Silver Spring, but it's way outside of Silver Spring. But my point is that it's this freedom of being able to express ourselves, of being able to have an ideal that we're looking at. And this is, in a sense, this freedom that Russia is curtailing, and this freedom that is at heart of the war. So the war is really about whether we can have differing opinions, whether we can live together, and what that looks like. So that's just a little bit of historical, view, I think, that helps to put this together, because when we're looking at all of this, we're looking at a dynamic that I think America is about.
But maybe let answer, and then there are two more questions.
It's just a demographic. At the time of Crimea, that I'd seen an official demographic report that said the eastern part of Ukraine was mostly Moscow Orthodox, the western Greek, and the middle mostly irreligious. So when I was saying that, I was talking more about the region that, like Putin may be saying, okay, Ukraine, you can go to that side, but not with us getting this, as historically our people. So is that demographic area, are they mostly still the Moscow Orthodox?
I just wanted to engage this very important question, just because this debate and discussion about the law is so complicated. It's well known, of course, that during the Soviet period there were a network of Russian Orthodox Church clergy that were run by the KGB as agents and informants. And some of them continue to hold prominent positions within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There is reliable information that not just propaganda, but in some cases, Ukrainian Orthodox Church clergy have provided information to Russian infantry units that help them to target more effectively. And in my visits to Kyiv over the last few years, when I've talked about this law, when you talk to representatives of the security services of the government of Ukraine, it's naturally these things that they point to as why the law is needed. My response to that is to say, yes, but you already have separate laws that are available to you that will allow you to deal with these kinds of clearly treasonous actions that don't require the banning of an entire church. My sense is that the security services support the law simply because they don't have the capacity under the conditions of war to fully pursue these cases the way they could be using the existing mechanisms. It's more efficient and easier to just ban the church. But what's interesting to me is that and this gets to the heart of your question, when I have conversations with just the general population about this law, people say, yes, they support the law, but they don't talk about the security violations. They don't talk about the assistance with targeting. What they talk about is just this idea that since Ukraine's independence, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has served as a conduit where drip by drip, bit by bit, Russian influence is projected into Ukraine. And now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, we won't tolerate it anymore. We need to get rid of this church. And that gets not just into freedom of religion territory, it gets into basic freedom of speech issues as well, which is why I think this will continue to be a complicated issue. When it comes to the security stuff, there are laws that you can do. You can focus on particular clergy with known and provable ties to the Russian security apparatus. When we talk about this broader issue of just ideas and influence, legally it becomes much more complicated.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So 2 more questions, and then
I will stand, otherwise I feel as in COVID time behind this door. I'm Mikhailo, I'm Ukrainian priest, I belong to St. Gabriel Institute. Mine will be not so question, but just 3 points I would like to share with you. We prefer to speak not Russo-Ukrainian war, but Russian war against Ukraine, against Ukrainian people, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian freedom. The second thing about this law, if we go to Russian Federation, Soviet Union, Russian Empire time, and we check Russians' law to ban, to block, to forbid other churches, mostly Ukrainian churches, then you will feel what is different, what is exactly the law that banned the church. If we go now to actual Ukraine, we will not find Russian churches closed. We will not find the Russian Orthodox who are persecuted. As mentioned, there are Russian clergy, people from Russian Orthodox Church clergy, or even lay people, who've been cooperating with KGB, FSB. That's a problem. That's the point of the law. For example, in my pastoral service, I do even as a military chaplain. And I'm a Catholic priest, Greek Catholic priest, Byzantine Rite. When we are coming together to pray, we are 2 different types of Catholics, Byzantine Rite and Latin Rite. Different Orthodox coming, Ukrainian Orthodox. We're coming together, Protestant, Jehovah's Witnesses. The people who says that I don't believe, but they are coming to stay together. The same situation in the front line. In the trench are staying Catholics, Orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, people who do not believe. They just say who do not believe, but usually in front line there are no people who don't believe in God. And this is the freedom. And the law is only against FSB and people who are trying to use the church. Unfortunately, Russian church during Soviet Union time became a part of administration of the regime, and being used against Ukrainian, against other countries, against other nations, as an instrument of the persecution.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Vasil Haranja, also St. Gabriel Institute. A few days ago, near the White House was the pro-Russian event called Immortal Regiment, so Besmertny Polk. It's really the manifestation of Ruski Mir, Russian world. Have you heard about it, and what do you think about?
If there is the last question, we may take it. Otherwise, we'll end here. Okay.
I'm happy to speak to the first question. I don't know anything about the Immortal Regiment, so I won't address that. I agree wholeheartedly that what's happening in Ukraine is not on the order of what happened in the Soviet Union or what's happened in Russian-occupied territories. I think the people who oppose the law but have this idea that somehow it's deep persecution are just misstating it for their own purposes. But I do think it's still problematic. I think it still violates religious freedom to punish a group when you can punish individuals for their individual actions. It has just serious rule of law problems.
I think as we're wrapping up and we think about how the Trump administration is going to be viewing Ukraine, first we need to prevent any kind of false equivalencies, that the situation in Ukraine and this law somehow makes it as bad as what's happening in Russia, or to forget about what's happening in Russia, in like mainland Russia, which is on a completely different level. I think the Biden administration was correct to designate Russia as a country of particular concern. The Trump administration would be right to continue that designation. And one of the key distinctions is the Ukrainian government welcomes the engagement of its allies on these tricky issues. And we have to recognize that in this existential battle, there's a democratic elected parliament that's trying to figure out how do we prevent third columns from providing that kind of examples that Peter listed, when we know there are coming through Russian Orthodox Church affiliated parishes. And as I said in my introduction, these are novel questions. This is not your run-of-the-mill registration issue in a minority group. These are novel questions that we really haven't encountered in Europe since World War II, and that's before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights existed. So we need to continue to engage the Ukrainians on how to navigate these tricky shoals to make sure that every person in Ukraine has freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, and not discriminated against or not jailed for their beliefs, while also recognizing there are real efforts by Russian-backed entities to influence the country in negative ways that benefit Putin. From the conversations I've had with Ukrainian officials, I know there's that spirit of conversation, and they welcome that engagement. And we help them make the right decisions in this very challenging environment.
Thank you very much.
I just want to add just a few points of reflection to this. I think that the activities of the Trump administration, the faith-based office, are very, very important. And I think that we do face many issues in our own country, and that I think that, as all of our panelists, I think, have shared, that the engagement and the understanding, especially of what's going on in Russian-occupied Ukraine, needs to come to the forefront. The Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, I know that the Ukrainian Catholic bishops met and shared, some of their stories. And as we've said, that there are, at least that I'm aware of, at least 30 Protestant ministers who are currently in jail in the Russian-occupied territories. And that I think that needs to be a priority, that we can leverage our international influence to bring them relief and to help them to reach to freedom. So I think that those need to be some of the key issues, and that we have this moment of negotiation, and that's a key issue that needs to be right up there in the forefront, and something that I think that they're in tune with, and I just want to encourage that.
Thank you very much. So before I will invite Professor Samuel Goldman, to formally close the meeting. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science here at GW and Executive Director of Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom and Democracy, co-sponsor of our event. Before he will close our event, I would like to thank Henry Hale for hosting us, Nini Pateridze for organizing all the logistics, and Matthew Curley for helping with that. So thanks, and please, Samuel.
Thank you. I have a very small and vestigial role here as co-sponsor, because in fact Pablo and his colleagues did all the work, but I just ask that you join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you also for your interest and questions. And with that, we are adjourned.